Welcome back. On this video, we're going to talk about castling. I mentioned it in our previous video, but I wanted to have a quick video that demonstrated castling. Castling occurs with the king and either of the rooks. And there are some rules to castling in order to perform it. In general, you want to castle by your 10th move. That's a good rule of thumb. You want to have developed your chess pieces to a place where you can castle within 10 moves. Now, if you've watched some games from some grandmasters, they may not always do that. But for beginning stages, you want to get castled on either the queen side or the king side within 10 moves. Because castling gets your king out of the middle of the board, and castling gets your king to a safer position. So I'm just going to do some typical development. I'm going to start out with a normal opening, e4, followed by e5, followed by d4 and d5. And then we can put our bishop here on b5, and we can play in c6, and then I'll play in f3, and black can play b4, white can play in c3. All right, now notice that, well, actually, I need to let black play first. So let's let black play in f6. So notice that there are no pieces between my king and my bishop. And actually, I'm going to develop a little bit more to get the bishop and the queen out on this side. So let's just develop that bishop there. We'll to bg5. We'll let this bishop develop to bb4. We'll take our queen to e2 and this queen to e7. All right, so now we see a symmetrical setup between black and white, and you see on the back ranks of both sides that it's just the rooks and just the kings. And so now if you click on the king, you'll see all the possible moves, and notice that these adjacent squares, D1 and 2 and F1, are all highlighted, but also C1 and G1, which are 2 away. Now, if you remember our first video and you don't know about castling, you may be scratching your head here because you're thinking, well, I thought the kings could only ever move 1. Well, that's true unless they're castling. And in fact, in castling, we're going to be moving 2 pieces at a time. So in castling, what's going to happen is this king, if we're castling king side, is going to move from e1 to g1, and the rook is going to move from h1 to f1. So let me just show you what that looks like. And you're always going to move your king first. So you want to, if you're in tournament play, grab your king and move him to, not grab your rook over, because that would just be your rook moving all by itself. So if you grab your king, move him over 2, now the computer in this simulation is going to automatically castle my rook for me to f1. So that's kingside castling, and if you look up the notation, which we haven't talked about a lot, started mentioning it, that's denoted as O-O. I'm just going to back up here in the simulation and show you that I can also castle on the queen side, and this is called the first one we did was a short side castle, because there's only 2 squares in between them, and this one's called a long side castle or a queen side castle because there's 3 squares between them. So if I just drag my king to the c1 square, and again the computer is going to complete the castling move for me. If you're playing on a standard board, you're going to have to grab that rook and then scoot the rook over to d1 after you've moved the king to c1. So that's castling, and note that it immediately puts the king kind of in this safe spot where the pawns are protecting him. This rook is here protecting him. It's probably also even more, it's probably safer if it's on the short side, because you can see he's more away from the center of the board. So that's castling, and of course black can castle too. And you can see with a good bit of development, we're still castled by move 8 for both black and white. That won't always happen, but in general, as I mentioned, a good rule of thumb is to castle by your 10th move. All right, so there are some rules about castling. If you have ever moved your king, you cannot castle. And I mentioned this in the previous video about checkmate. So let's just make a move here with my king, and then we'll let black castle, and I'll make my king go back to its starting point at e1, and let's let this bishop come to g6. Now, note when I click on my king, the possible moves are limited just to the normal possible moves. G1 and C1 are not highlighted. That's because I moved my king. So once you move your king, no castling at all. So let's back up. And now let's say I move my rook. We'll go ahead and let black castle. I'll move my rook back. Again, we'll move the pawn to g6. Now I click my king. Note that the g1 square is not highlighted as a possible move. So not only has the king have to have been stationary, but the rook with which he will castle must be stationary. So notice that I still have c1 as an optional square. So I can still castle long because this rook, my A rook, had not moved yet. But my H rook, because it had moved, now castling with it becomes invalid. All right, some more rules with castling. Let me just back up again. Let's say I develop G3, and this bishop takes my knight to bxc3 plus. Now this bishop has put my king in check, and when the king is in check, he cannot castle. Note his only options for movement now are d1 and f1. He can't move to d2 because it's under attack by the bishop, and the squares c1 and g1 are not available for castling because the king cannot castle when he is in check. Okay, and I want to demonstrate the last rule that's associated with castling. So I'm going to develop this pawn to g6, and I'm going to move my queen to d3, qd3. We'll do b6, and I'll move my knight here to the rim in h4, again just for demonstration purposes. Generally, we do not want our knights on the edge of the board. And note that this bishop is attacking along this d1 h5 diagonal. And so obviously the king cannot move there. Actually, I need to make another move for black so that it's white's turn. So we'll just castle black. So obviously the king cannot move to d1 because that'd put him in check. He can move up to d2, f1, or he can castle and go to this g1 square. But note that c1 is not an available square. And that's because this bishop is gazing on this d1 square, and the king cannot castle through check. So the king cannot castle in check, and he cannot castle through check. Now, the rook can move through an attack. So let me demonstrate that. Okay, so I made a number of moves to finally get this bishop attacking the b1 square. So just to open up this diagonal, obviously these are not moves that would be associated with any normal game, but I wanted to show you that the the rook can move through an attack square. It's just the king that cannot move through an attack square. So if you notice, when I click on the king, he has basically all the squares open to him except for f2, where this pawn is blocking him. So he can castle alongside here, even though this bishop is attacking and the rook moves to it. So it's just the king that cannot move through check when castling. All right, so just to review, castling is a good idea. It should be done by the 10th move of the game. Generally, you're going to castle kingside, and that means, if I reset the board here, that the bishop and the knight on the king side must vacate their squares in order for castling to occur. Castling cannot occur if the king has ever moved, and castling cannot occur with a rook that has already moved. Castling cannot occur if the king is in check, and castling cannot occur if the king were to move through check or move through a square that is under attack. So that's castling, and hope you enjoyed this video.